Okay, today we're going to talk more about triangles, and we're going to talk about what makes two triangles congruent to each other. So if two triangles are congruent, then we can say that all their corresponding parts are congruent. So we figure out what parts are corresponding by looking at the names of the triangles. So if I look at DEF and KJI, D and K are the first letters in those two names. So that means that angle D and angle K are congruent. E and J are in the middle, so you can see that they're congruent. We give them two arcs in their angles so that we know they're congruent to each other, but not congruent to D and K. F and I are congruent. We can do the same thing for the segments. If we just look at the names, D and E is congruent to K, J, the two letters next to each other. EF is congruent to JI. And last but not least, DF is congruent to KI. And again, we have a different number of slashes on the sides to show which sides are congruent to each other, and also show that not all 6 sides are congruent. So that's what we call the congruent corresponding parts. And then if we wanted to write all those facts out, we call those congruent statements, and they look like this. And this is just me writing what I just said. Angle D congruent to angle K, E congruent to J, F congruent to I, and so forth. So here I have triangle TUV and GFE, and I want to know if those two triangles are congruent, then what angle is congruent to angle G. So I'm just going to go look at their names and see that G is the first letter in triangle GFE. So that means that the first letter in TUV, T, is going to be congruent. And we can show that on the picture just by putting an arc in T and an arc in G. If I have ZXY and ZXC, I want to know what's congruent to XY. So I see XY are the last two letters, so that means XC is congruent to XY. And I can show that on the picture. XY and XC each get a slash. Those two sides are congruent. They correspond to each other. So pause here and try this one. So again, if I look at the two names, I want to know which angle is congruent to U. U is the last letter in WVU. If I look at GHI, I is the last letter. That means that U and I are congruent. They have the corresponding angles that are congruent to each other in those two congruent triangles. So that was real quick, but I want you to try this one and put your answer in online. Make sure you answer using the Google form, and I'll answer any questions in class.